Hi, everyone. I hope everybody's doing great. As a quick introduction, my name is Brian. I'm one of Bayzat's co-founders and its Chief Marketing Officer. Bayzat's UAE's leading employee benefits platform. And as we've moved into hyper growth over the last couple of years, we started investing a lot more in our marketing resources, which has allowed us to both grow and make tons of mistakes along the way. So hopefully some of the insights I'll share with you guys today will be helpful as you roll out marketing initiatives across your respective organizations. Prior to running through a list of questions that we like to ask ourselves before we launch any campaign, I would like to first reiterate the importance of adopting a growth mindset across the entire organization. The reality is that small wins only compound to huge success over time, the constant experiments, optimization, and iterations. And I think when people think about growth, they equate to growth marketing, but the truth is that growth and experimentation should run across all departments. On the back of that, though, and more specific to marketing, do make absolutely sure that you have the right foundation and process to optimize your campaigns prior to any activation. So for Bayzat, one of our core goals for 2021 was to drive qualified leads to the sales team. When we think about experiments, we always ran them in 2-week sprints. What we would do is we would have different team members come up with ideas. We would debate them every single week across the pillars of impact, confidence, and resources. We would look at predictions, hypotheses, any data that we could bring to the table, and we'd vote for the best ideas. That would move into activation, and the relevant team member would be responsible for not only optimization and execution of the campaign, but also running retrospective afterwards. The point being is that you should absolutely instill a growth experimentation process in your company as soon as possible and treat it as an always-on function of the marketing team. The other thing that we like to stress is to make sure it's okay to take big bets. It's okay to make mistakes, but as long as you're systematic about capturing learnings so you can improve future initiatives as well. On the back of that, something else that's really important for us is to make sure that we instill the research mindset across the organization. So obviously, it's very important to understand benchmarks, what your competition is doing, what best in class looks like. But we also found leveraging research to be a really good accelerator of ideas. So an example that we looked at for the marketing team that we launched that was quite beneficial was we would have different team training sessions and different team members would be responsible for coming up with different ideas and kind of coaching the rest of the team across these sessions. Not only that did that improve the overall knowledge of the team base, but we found that to be a really, really great idea generator and experimentation, driving experiments as well. And the last thing I would like to stress is to make sure to treat your post-campaign analysis and retrospectives as equally important as the ideation and activation phases with any campaign that you launch. You know, in startups, it's super hectic. As marketers, I think we're very guilty of moving on to the next thing without spending enough time understanding the previous campaign. So what we do at Bayzat that we find quite useful is anybody that's responsible for launching the campaign is also responsible to present back to the team analysis, retrospectives, learnings, and so forth. We also put together a very comprehensive living document by channel, by median, tied to all the insights that we learned along the ways for all campaigns that we tap into for any future initiative. So with that said, I think Benjamin Franklin has a really relevant saying that goes something like, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And I think that absolutely rings true when you set up any marketing campaign that you go through. And this is the list of questions that we like to ask ourselves before we launch any initiative. The first one is, do our campaign objectives align with the company's wider goals? It's very important to always be purposeful with your marketing objectives, but more important in a startup when company budgets when your budgets are limited and company-wide targets are fluid. On the back of that, have you clearly defined campaign objectives? So the rule of thumb at Bayzat is before we move into any type of execution phase, we sit down as a team to understand what the campaign objectives are to make sure that they fit within the company goals. Another really important point that we always ask ourselves is what problem we're trying to solve, which target persona we're trying to hit. So, the name of the game for any marketing campaign is relevancy. As a marketer, obviously you need to know your competition and your customers and prospects really, really well. Two things I would really like to stress here, though, is one, the importance of identifying your ideal customer profile. So if you haven't done that yet, I strongly encourage you to do so. For Bayzat, we defined our ICP by looking at a ton of quantitative data, a lot of qualitative conversations with customers and prospects to understand what the ICP looked like within our addressable market. Over and above that, once we understood what the ICP was, we also developed really comprehensive buyer personas. And these buyer personas, not only did we understand what the challenges these customers are facing or prospects are facing, but also how Bayzat could alleviate these pain points. So the point being, if you want to be really, really relevant, both in marketing, but across your company, you need to make sure that you have really strong ICP and really well-defined buyer personas to make your campaigns as relevant as possible. Over and above that, Another very important question that we ask is, have we mapped out what key metrics look like and have we defined success for this campaign? And I think metrics that you track is very dependent on what your objectives are. If it's something like lead generation, obviously cost per lead, leads opportunity, conversion rate, so forth, versus branding, when you look at reach and whatnot. Whatever it is, you need to make sure that you have very, very clearly defined metrics before activation to make sure you can optimize the campaign throughout the journey and also analyze its results. On the back of that, we always ask ourselves if we have the right tracking in place to make sure that we're able to optimize our campaigns. The beauty of digital, theoretically, is everything's trackable, but the reality is it takes a ton of time and effort to set up your reporting and your tracking. So I highly encourage you to spend the right time before you activate your initiatives. Over and above that, if you have the budget, make sure to invest in a good marketing tech stack because it pays dividends many times over. Once you understand that, the other question we like to ask ourselves is, what learnings do we have from previous campaigns that can influence this current one? And that's really where, at the beginning of the session, I mentioned making sure that you have a really comprehensive document in place. We always tap into that as a team to make sure that once we launch this current campaign, we have all the insights we need to make sure that we're successful as possible. The other question that we like to ask ourselves is, what's our campaign budget? And depending on what campaign budget we have, what channels we plan on using, online and offline. Especially online, the other question that we always challenge ourselves is, are we nimble enough to add and drop tracking channels based off how campaigns going, tied to the company objectives, campaign objectives, and metrics? Over and above these questions, something that's really important for us is, do we have buy-in from relevant stakeholders? So especially in B2B marketing, especially in B2B, marketing and sales is joined at the hip. And it's super important that you have buy-in from relevant stakeholders to make sure that the campaign that marketing is running is relevant to either your customers or your prospects as well. So the general rule of thumb that we have at Bayzat is, before we launch any thought leadership content piece, we need to make sure that the content we're writing towards is helping solve sales problems or post-sales problems and so forth, and is very relevant for our customers or prospects. Over and above that, a very important question we ask ourselves is, have we equipped the other departments with the right support to make sure our marketing campaigns are as successful as possible? Right? So if you think about the continuation between marketing and sales on a B2B level, one thing that we make sure we do is we develop campaign playbooks that we circulate to relevant stakeholders. So an example of a campaign playbook might have all the marketing details, so what the media plan looks like, what assets we're using, and so forth. But we'd also make sure that we have specific playbooks for the sales team. New emails, videos, testimonials, collaterals, and so forth, to make sure two things happen. One is the messaging is a continuation of what marketing is saying, that sales is also talking about to the prospects, and also making sure that we empower the sales team to convert as many leads as possible. And finally, the last question we like to ask ourselves is, how we effectively communicate the campaign objectives to company-wide employees. Not only is making sure that interdepartmental alignment happens, but more importantly is we found employee advocacy to be a really good way to extend brand reach. So what we did in a previous major campaign that we launched is we conducted an all hands. We basically walked the entire company through the idea, and we also then created a scoreboard and a hashtag. We encouraged employees to basically share posts, help us generate leads and so forth, and we track everything through this hashtag, add them to the scoreboard, and then the top 5 employees won a prize. We found that to be a really fun way to kind of engage employees, but also drive employee advocacy through their social feeds that'll help extend reach. So I hope that some of these insights were useful and actionable, and I wish you the best of luck as you continue your entrepreneurial journey. Hi guys, we're going to bring up Assad right now just to ask a few questions that was raised by the audience.
Thank you for sharing your insights, Brian. I think those were some really good areas to avoid for any marketers in the field who are looking to introduce their campaigns. So in terms of questions, let's have a look through some of these interesting ones that have come through. The first one that comes to mind is, what would you recommend is the best way to map and target users relevant to a campaign?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's super important to keep in mind is segmentation is key. And I think the other thing is, it really depends on what your core metrics are, which target persona your campaign is supposed to resonate the most with. So I think when it comes to segmentation, especially on digital, once you have a general idea, it's fine to activate your campaign, but just make sure that you have the right visibility to continuously optimize and kind of revise segments and target personas in order to meet your core metrics.
Awesome. And it's interesting that you mentioned metrics, because in the world of marketing, we do tend to get a bit of slack from times for being too obsessed with metrics, and there's a million and one things to measure, whether that's cost per lead, actual funnels, everything, the A to Z. So to that effect, what would you say is the one marketing metric that is paramount when it comes to measuring a campaign success?
I don't think there's one specific metric that you can track. I think it's very dependent on your campaign and its objectives. So for example, if your campaign was to drive qualified leads for the sales team to help generate pipeline or generate revenue, the big metric there, or the big metrics would be obviously your cost per lead and your landing page conversion rates. But the one that I would really keep an eye out for is your lead to opportunity or lead to deal one conversion rates. Right? If you're driving a ton of leads at the top of the funnel, but they're not converting, then you basically burning cash and you're not helping the sales team. So on the other hand, if the objective is about branding, then of course your big metric is probably impressions tied to your key segmentation that you define.
Awesome. And going back to the subject of campaigns and what works and what doesn't work, from your time at Bayzat, what would you say is an example of a campaign that was the best that you've launched to date and you took a lot of successful takeaways from it?
So I think about 2021. I don't think about one single campaign that drove wild success versus, the goal for the business in 2021 is to generate as many qualified leads as possible for the sales team. And it was a ton of experiments, ton of campaigns, ton of optimization that allowed us to move from essentially 2 online traction channels to 5. Right, so it allowed us to diversify the number of channels that we leverage. We're able to basically increase the channels from always on spending budget and really start driving an additional pipeline to the sales team to hit the targets. So for me, I look at it as a year of experimentation and optimization, tons of campaigns being run in order to get from 2 to 5 traction channels is always on.
Awesome. And just to play devil's advocate here for a second, so we've talked about one that did well. The flip side of that would be, is there one that perhaps didn't do so well? And why do you think it didn't work so well?
Yeah, I think it was end of 2020, if I remember correctly. We were obsessed with lead volumes and cost per lead. And we started running a ton of different campaigns on Facebook. A lot of ad creatives, a lot of time spent, a lot of budget spent. And we got super excited because our CPL started dropping significantly. The volumes of leads were going up. But we didn't really pay close enough attention to the lead to opportunity or lead to deal conversion rates. So, the team was patting themselves in the back thinking what a great job they did. They quadrupled the lead volumes. But as you started working closer with the sales team, you realize that actually none of these leads were converting. So essentially we burnt a ton of cash along the way. And that kind of really fed into 2021 and the importance to make sure you have the right tracking, the right alignment with sales, to make sure that you serve that everything's running smoothly.
Definitely. It all boils down to experimentation. Like sometimes you win in the experiment, sometimes you don't, but unless you do them, you'll never find out for real.
Exactly.
And then to that effect, one last one that I think is an interesting one. From the campaigns that didn't work so well, you mentioned a couple of things about how to improve your tracking and how perhaps Facebook is not the platform for you guys. But how can founders avoid making such expensive mistakes when it comes to campaigns?
I think playing with smaller budgets, having a much clearer idea of what ultimate success looks like, running a few test campaigns, learning from them, and then scaling and moving forward. And on the back end, though, something to keep in mind is it's okay to try things again. So Facebook didn't work in 2020. It worked really well in 2021, end of the year, for whatever reason. So we didn't shy away from using that channel again.
Definitely. It's, as we say, one size never fits all, and you have to sometimes go back to something just to see, okay, maybe it didn't work this way. Let's try it in a different approach. But this has been great. Thank you so much for your time, Brian, and for sharing your insights. It's been wonderful to have you join us today.